Awesome. We're live with Ronan Levy, co-founder and executive chairman of Field Trip Health. It's awesome to have you here, Ronan.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So for those out there who don't know what Field Trip is, it's not a field trip that you take with your school. It's a little bit different than that. Can you give us a little background on the company and what you're building?
Yeah, it's definitely not a field trip you take with your school, but I can tell you it's a much better trip and it's way more educational. Um, just kidding. So what we're building with Field Trip is what has become the world's largest integrated psychedelic therapeutics company, and what that means is that um, for those who are not otherwise aware, psychedelics are having an incredible scientific, medical, and cultural renaissance. You know, not everyone, most people are probably familiar with the stories of the 60s and 70s with the hippies and Woodstock and counterculture, and how psychedelics were subsequently scheduled and research largely prohibited in the early 1970s in response to that. The unfortunate part of that story is that up to that point, most of the work with psychedelics had actually been focused on the therapeutic applications of psychedelics like psilocybin, like LSD, and they were showing profound results. And then the research just stopped, mostly for political as opposed to scientific or medical reasons. Over the last 10 years or so, research has begun in earnest, really in response to the mental health crisis we're facing globally. And what we're finding with psychedelics is that their therapeutic potential is just as promising, if not more promising, than what was thought of in the 50s and 60s when research started. And now that's starting to hit the mainstream, and that's starting to hit medicine, the medical community, and the therapeutic applications are starting to come to market. So with Field Trip, we're really working to build the infrastructure to make that happen, and that's happening on two levels. One is we're building out the clinical spaces to deliver psychedelic assisted therapies, because unlike conventional medicines, psychedelics are about experience. It's about the experience of the medicine. And I can talk a little bit about why we seem to see such profound results with psychedelic therapies, but I'll do that a little bit later. But one thing we do know is that this is not something you want to do in a hospital setting. This is not something you want to do in a doctor's office with white walls and fluorescent lights. Although I am currently sitting in a room with white walls and fluorescent lights, that's an entirely different conversation. And so you actually need new spaces to deliver these therapies. It's just that the space doesn't exist. The infrastructure doesn't exist to deliver psychedelic therapies at scale to a lot of people. And so through our Field Trip Health division, we're building out those spaces. We currently have locations in Toronto, New York, LA, Chicago, Atlanta, Houston. We're opening up in San Diego, Silicon Valley, Seattle, Washington, D.C., Austin, Texas, Miami, Florida, and a number of other places I can't remember off the top of my head at the moment, where we're providing ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, ketamine being a legal approved anesthetic, but can also be used as a psychedelic in a very similar context. On the other side of the equation, we're doing R&D and focus on developing the next generation of psychedelic molecules, because the interest in the renaissance that's happening right now has been focused on LSD, on psilocybin, on MDMA, molecules that are known, well characterized, well studied, to be quite honest. And they're showing incredible impact. But that doesn't mean we can't do better. It doesn't mean we can't have more precise drugs, more effective drugs, more gentler drugs, safer drugs. I mean, all of these molecules are generally quite safe overall, but doesn't mean we can't do better. And so through our Field Trip Discovery division, we're developing what we believe will be the next generation of psychedelic markets that will be approved for use in various applications for various indications. And so that's Field Trip in a not so short nutshell.
So that was an awesome overview, and there's lots to unpack there. Something I'm curious about is sort of the road that led you down to what you're building today and where you're currently sitting. If you can think of three main inflection points that got you here today, can we go back in time and hear a little bit about the story?
Sure. I'll pick three inflection points. A couple of moments come to mind that led to this point. Actually, there's probably more than three, but I'm going to go way back to grade 8 going into grade 9, from grade 1 to grade 8, I was at a private school in Hamilton, Ontario, which is 45 minutes west of Toronto. And I despised school. Like, it was the worst of all things for me. Like, I didn't like my class. I didn't like my school. I didn't like my classmates. It was a pretty miserable experience for many of my years there. And I was always a year ahead of myself. Like, I started school a year early. So I was the youngest in my class, and I'm not a big dude by stature either, being a whopping 5'9" and even smaller then. And so I got picked on a lot. And it was a really unpleasant experience for many of those years. And in grade 9, I went from Hillfield, which is a private school, to a public school called Westdale, also in Hamilton. And it was such a different world for me. Like, it was the first time I actually felt accepted by my peers. Like, in Hillfield, maybe it was a sign of the times, but it felt like if you were smart, you were a nerd. And if you weren't smart, then you were accepted amongst the sort of jocular crowd, but never the twain shall meet. And when I got to public school, I was able to be a lot more myself. I was accepted for who I was. Doing well in school wasn't something to be shunned. It was something that people actually took a lot of pride in. And it was just a different audience. And it really made me feel, for the first time, at home in any kind of academic setting and amongst friends. And, I think it really changed the course of my life in many ways, where I've met people who were conscientious, thoughtful, athletic, smart, and it showed me that you could have the best of all worlds and be appreciated for it. So it was a really eye-opening experience going to Westdale. And unlike at Hillfield, where I never tried to succeed and do well in school, at Westdale I did, and I ended up turning out to be a pretty decent student, and I got good grades. Ultimately went to University of Toronto for undergrad. And then ultimately law school at the University of Toronto. For our American friends listening, is like, in terms of its academic requirements to get in, it's kind of like Harvard. It is the most stringent in terms of acceptance criteria in Canada for law schools. So to go from a kid who always felt like an imposter in grade school and high school in terms of getting good grades to getting into one of the most prestigious law schools in Canada was a great sense of achievement and validation for me. But it was also a critical pivot point. Did you want to ask any questions there before I kind of?
Yeah, I would love to.
All right.
So looking back, little Ronan, you went from private school to public school, and that sort of was like this breakthrough moment. What were your favorite? What were you best at? Like, when you looked at yourself at school, were you more of a math and science guy, or more of a writing, history, English person who eventually went to law school?
I was kind of a jack of all trades and master of none, which is, I got 100% in grade 11 phys ed.
Okay.
So, but if you showed up and had your uniform on and were halfway athletic, you could get 100% in gym. So I wouldn't show that as a sign of overall achievement. No, I just did pretty well across the board. So, mid 80s, low 90s, math, science, English, not in art, not in music. I do not have much of at least as conventionally defined artistic skills. I just figured out how to try hard. That's really what it came down to, is learning to apply myself and realizing that I was capable of teaching myself and learning things and figuring things out. Just through effort, just through trying. Yeah. And at Hillfield, I never did, right? Like, I had no incentive to. The best thing that could happen from getting a good grade was that I would get made fun of by my so-called friends. And so at Westdale, it became a very different conversation where people thought that was great and wanted to hang out with smart people and all that kind of stuff.
Besides the environment that led to this kind of thriving, any teachers that come to mind that stood out and really nurtured you or helped you see your potential? Yeah,
absolutely. My grade 13, or OIC is what we called it. I may refer to grade 13 as OIC. History teacher. He was a guy named Mr. Mall, Richard Mall. And he had taught in another school in the school board. And my friend Nick, his mom, I guess, knew him. And so when Mr. Mall had started, like there was all these rumors about him being like a strict disciplinarian, ruthless, very hard, demands a lot of his students. And so I was a little bit concerned going into the first day of class. On the second day of class, and on the first day of class, he had assigned us some reading. On the second day of class, he gave us a pop quiz. Well, and I hadn't done the reading. Like, it was the first day of school. There's no way I was kind of putting that effort, especially in grade 13 when you're kind of in cruise control at that point in school. And I was like, oh man, this guy is going to be as bad as, the rumors kind of suggested. Farthest thing from the truth. I've never met anyone so passionate about teaching, so concerned about the kids in his class, so encouraging, so positive. He expected a lot, but he gave a lot back. And, he was the first teacher that I felt like really invested in my success, like my success, and not just mine, everybody in his class. Our success was his success, and he really measured his performance on our performance. And if we were underperforming, he took that on himself to make a correction, and not just like trying to tell the students that they're getting bad grades and they need to try harder. So much so to the point that when we were writing our final exam in the class, which was, I think at the end of that year, so some of the last exams we were writing in high school, he actually stopped the class, wanted to take a picture because he loved us so much, and started crying because he was going to miss us. And like,
wow,
it was just such a breath of fresh air where a teacher like actually believes in you and genuinely wants the best for you and works hard to encourage you. I still like get emotional talking about him because like he was a once in a lifetime teacher, but he is a teacher that has still left a mark on my life. Because when people say like, who is your favorite teacher, there's no hesitation in my mind. It was Mr. Mall, and I'm not alone in saying that. Like, he was just generally a wonderful person and a great teacher. So yeah, he stands
amazing.
out.
Thank you, Mr. Mall.
Yeah, indeed.
And then last question before we get to the second inflection point or pivot. How did you decide to go to law school? Besides having Jewish parents.
Well, that's pretty much the answer. So growing up, my parents split up when I was very young. I was 2 years old or so when they split up. And suffice to say, the divorce was sufficiently acrimonious that you can read articles about it in the Globe and Mail, which is kind of one of the leading Canadian newspapers back in the day when it was okay to talk about people's dirty laundry in the newspaper, including, mentioning their kids' names and all that kind of stuff.
Wow.
Not so cool these days, but back then it seemed perfectly fine. Anyway, I grew up surrounded by lawyers for a lot of my younger life, just given how protracted and acrimonious the divorce proceedings were. And I remember that to this day, some of the lawyers came to our house. I don't know if they were just coming for, socializing to say hello, or there was work being done. But one of them sat down beside me when I was playing Commodore 64. Now I'm definitely dating myself. We were playing Commodore 64. And like, he just treated me like a human being. He played games with me. He showed interest in me. He was just a nice human being. And I remember telling my mom after that, like, I think I want to be a lawyer when I grow up. And I can tell you with certainty that I was never allowed to forget that moment in my life. And so it was always in my mind that I wanted to be a lawyer, really having no sense of what it really meant to be a lawyer or what the profession of law was like. But just having a lot of respect for these people, who seem to show a lot of interest and care for me. So that was the moment that I kind of embarked on my way to law school.
Amazing. So you go to law school, and what happens from there? What's the next crucial moment?
Going to law school was inflection point number 2.
Okay, cool.
Because I get to law school. It's my first day at law school. Still have a pretty severe imposter complex. Kind of felt like I got through high school because I just kind of figured out how to play the game, and I got good teachers and they made it easy on me. And then like in university, I obviously did pretty well. But again, I felt like, nah, it's not that I'm actually that smart. I just figured out how to play the game. I took the right courses. I got the right TAs and all that kind of stuff, and I got good grades. By the time I get to law school, I'm feeling a little bit more confident in my skills, but not very much so. But when I get there, I look around and I see all the people, and I'm like, these are not my people. These are not my people at all. You know, I have some very wonderful friends from law school, but my entire life, I've always been a bit of a contrarian. I've always been a bit of a shit disturber. Like it was just like not in creating trouble, not in like pissing teachers off or anything along those lines, but always taking positions that people don't anticipate. You know,
Mm.
I always loved surprising people with some of the things I would say and do. You know, I remember um, I remember when I was a kid. This is, I guess, kind of an inflection point, and I'm ruining your three inflection point
No, no,
question.
no.
But
Give me all of them.
yeah, when I was a kid, in the Globe and Mail, in that paper I was talking about before, that had that very juicy, big article about my parents' divorce. I used to read it when I was like 8 or 9 years old. I used to try and read the Globe and Mail. Not that I understood much of what was going on, but I tried to pretend. And on the front cover, at the bottom right corner, they always had like a little joke of the day or something, a quote of the day kind of piece. It's no longer part of the newspaper, but back then it was, and that'd be one of the things I could read because it was short enough and like easy enough to digest that as a kid I could make sense of it, where I wasn't going to read, you know, the big articles on the front page. Um, and in that corner one day, there was a quote from Mark Twain. I don't remember exactly what the quote was from Mark Twain, but in the attribution, they said, you know, they attributed it to Mark Twain and they put a comma and they described him as the stern foe of all sham. And I had no idea what that meant, but something about it spoke to my soul as being something I liked. And so I cut out that little corner of the paper and stuck it in my wallet and carried that quote around in my wallet for years. It took me a long time to sort of appreciate what being a stern foe of all sham meant. But I realized that so much of it is kind of my personality, which is, and I still hold this to be true, which is so much of our lives every day is defined by inertia. We get up every morning and we brush our teeth. We don't ask why we brush our teeth. We just kind of accept it as so. I'm not suggesting brushing your teeth is a bad thing or is a habit you feel should be discarding, but it's a simple example of like so much of our lives is done by rote. So much of the path that
Yeah.
we're on is defined by other people's expectations. And very few people actually stop to say, why? Why is that? Why do we do that? Is it actually necessary? Does it make sense anymore? Is it based on a belief that I actually support? Or is it just something that exists? And so, very often throughout high school and university, I would write papers taking a contrarian position. You know, I remember one in particular in third year of undergrad. I took a course called The History and Philosophy of Science. And one of the papers we had to write was about why the theory of evolution, why Darwin's theory of evolution became, you know, de facto law, even though it's still a theory in science, whereas other competing perspectives of around adaptation and evolution were discarded. And so, you know, everyone's position, everyone wrote the paper of Darwin's theory of evolution won because it was the better theory. It answered the questions around the theory of evolution better. And I took the position that Darwin's theory of evolution was no better than any other theory of evolution because they're all theories. They were just a bunch of circumstantial events and social trends and cultural influences that ultimately led to its adoption, as opposed to anything about the merits of the theory itself. And like that was just always what I did. I always had to take that position. I always had to kind of stand out. And so when I got to law school, and I'm much more contrarian, I'm a person who likes to challenge the rules, question the rules, than seek to obey or interpret the rules. I realized that it was not a place for me. And I realized that my future career in evolution would be probably very different than the path of all the people standing next to me. And it was kind of nice to kind of accept that, to sort of see like, I've been on this path for a long time trying to get to law school to validate that I could do it. Now that I'm here, I don't want to do it. I'm going to finish
Mm.
it. And I didn't finish law school. And I ultimately went to work, you know, on Bay Street, which is the equivalent of Wall Street for Canada, and ultimately that kind of stuff. But recognizing that I was smart, that I was capable, that I could actually compete with some of the best academic minds in Canada at U of T, and then choosing consciously to veer off that path and do something very different was also a significant inflection point in my life.
Besides being in that environment with those like folks that maybe you didn't see yourself like being in the same mindset as, did you have up till that point, did you have any of psychedelic experiences of your own that maybe had impacted your mindset?
No, no.
No, not
I
yet.
mean, I guess maybe unintentionally so. When I was in high school, I went to a concert. I saw Blur and Ned's Atomic Dustbin and Our Lady Peace, and I can't remember who headlined the concert. Anyway, doesn't matter for the story. I had taken an antihistamine, like properly as an antihistamine to like deal with allergies and all that kind of stuff, and it was a new antihistamine, and it totally spaced me out. And for a couple of weeks, I felt totally spaced out, not in a good way. It was a very unpleasant experience. It felt like everything was always a little bit dreamy, and it actually scared the shit out of me, for lack of a better term. And so for a long time, I was actually straight edge. I wouldn't touch drugs. I wouldn't touch alcohol. I wouldn't touch any of them because I never wanted to feel that feeling of not being myself and never knowing if I was going to be myself again. Um, so no, psychedelics had no impact on my life to that point. I had only discovered the joys of alcohol in second year of undergrad after breaking up with a girlfriend and having really nothing better to do than hang out with friends and get drunk. And then I realized how fun that could be. Now that I'm older, the pain is not worth the joy, but
Yeah.
in university, it was a lot of fun. But even then, to that point in my life, it certainly made up for a lack of drinking in high school. But beyond that, I'd never tried cannabis. I'd never tried uh, psychedelics, never tried mushrooms, never tried LSD, never tried any of them. Really had very little interest in doing so, to be quite honest.
Cool. Okay. And then another question that I've asked before, but and you kind of like are giving it to me as a layup is, what do you currently believe that most people would disagree with you on? Maybe outside of just like what you're doing in terms of your work, but since you do kind of go against the grain, I'm curious if there's anything that pops out at you in terms of the way that you see the world that most people would disagree with.
That's a good question. I don't. Yeah, I'm going to give an answer, which is a true one. I don't know if it's like the most complete or the best answer I can give, but I'm a big believer in reality creation, which means I genuinely believe we create our own realities, that we're literally making up our entire experience. And there's actually some scientific evidence to justify that. I'm happy to give a little bit of insight into why I think that's not such an outlandish statement, even from a scientific or medical perspective. But most importantly for me is that when I started to think about reality creation and what it means that if you believe that you are the author of your own reality, it also means that you are the author of your entire experience and everything that happens in your life. And if you become the author of everything that happens in your own life, you can never be a victim. You are always choosing the circumstances in which you live. And I know that offends a lot of people because there are survivors of all sorts of trauma that say, I would never have chosen that. And that's entirely fair response. What I like about that, though, is that I can never be a victim if I'm the author of my own fortune or misfortune. I always have the capacity to take a
Agency.
terrible circumstance and make something out of it other than life gave me a raw deal. Because if you believe only that life gave me a raw deal, then where are you supposed to go with that? There's nothing you can do with that. If you choose to believe that there's something I can or I'm meant to take away from this experience, no matter how terrible it is, at least you have the capacity to find some good out of that. And I think that's one of the most empowering perspectives anyone can have, because the alternative is so disempowering. It's really hard for me to want to even contemplate it.
I love that. I'm glad we got that little boost of wisdom before we get to your third inflection point. Thanks for
Yeah,
sharing.
no problem.
So you go to Wall Street, and then what? And then what happens? What gets you out of there, or what other inflection point kind of led you here?
Yeah, so being a bit of a contrarian and independently minded person, like I had always been dabbling with entrepreneurship, and me and my friend Owen in particular had been working on various different business ideas. None of them ever really came to fruition, but I managed to escape the clutches and the golden handcuffs of Bay Street. Worked in house at at a pharmaceutical biotech company for a while. Um, Worked at Much Music and MTV Canada for a while as a lawyer. Worked at an online dating company for a while, and then after working at that online dating company, this is over the course of 6 or 7 years, always progressively trying to move out of law and into the business side of things. After I worked at that online dating company, and I learned a lot there. About really how you can be a truly effective shit disturber and contrarian and get away with it and make a lot of hay with that in a very constructive way. Um, I I left to start my first business or to become an entrepreneur. I was going to give up the lawyer mantle once and for all, which I did unsuccessfully. I'll explain that. Started a business. The business still operates. We owned a cash for gold store. We actually own a few cash for gold stores. And I got into that business in part from circumstance and fortune, in part because I realized that there's a wonderful opportunity out there for people who have enough self assurance in their belief structures to do things that a lot of people won't. So like I never had aspirations of being a cash for gold buyer. If it's anything in the US, if it's anything like it's in Canada, you don't necessarily want to deal with many people in the cash for gold industry. They tend to be sleazy, slimy, people who will take advantage of any opportunity. I mean, this is a gross overgeneralization, but that's how it really operates in Canada, to be quite honest. And I realized that there was an opportunity to bring some legitimacy, authenticity, and transparency to the cash for gold industry. That if you could do it like a normal human wants to be treated, as opposed to, someone who's going to try and rook you for every dime he can get out of you, you could make a really good business out of that. And so even though it was an industry that had a terrible reputation, it was a great opportunity by leaning into that and bringing legitimacy and transparency and authenticity to that. And so that business started, it's been successful, it continues to operate. We've been around for 10 years. Wasn't my lifelong ambition to be in the gold industry or the cash for gold industry. So once that business was up and running, we brought in management around the kind of day-to-day stuff. And I went back to being a lawyer, working with startups, just trying to integrate myself. This was about 10 years ago when the first real startup wave, the real startup boom was happening. And so I went back to just practicing law, working with startups, technology companies, and all that kind of stuff, because I had a pretty good experience with that, working at Much Music and MTV. And through that experience, I ended up meeting a couple of guys. One's named Joseph, one was Hanan, and Leo, who's no longer involved. And they had started a business and sold it and had left the acquirer after kind of going through their earnout. And they were looking to do something new. And so I got introduced to them as a lawyer, but a lawyer who had a pretty good business savvy, I think. And so we had a lot of conversations. And so eventually we batted around some business ideas. They ended up pursuing one. I did some legal work for it. They shut it down because it wasn't working. We got together a few months later and they had 10 new ideas on a whiteboard for new startup ideas that they were going to pursue. And apparently I looked at the list and I said, well, these are all crap. You may want to start again with a new list. I don't remember being so brusque, but that's how they tell the story. And so I was leaving, I was putting on my coat, and they're like, well, there's this one other idea. And I'm like, what's that? I'm like, well, the laws around medical cannabis in Canada are changing. So there's an idea to build an online marketplace similar to what Leafly in the US has become, which is something that I think some of your listeners may be familiar with, but for Canada. And I was like, and why aren't you guys doing this? And they're like, well, it's marijuana. It seems so sleazy and shady. And we just don't really want to attach our reputations to like such a scuzzy industry. And I'm like, guys, how often do you get an opportunity where a multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar industry goes from underground to entirely legal overnight? Like this is an amazing opportunity. If you guys aren't going to pursue this, I'm going to pursue this because I can tell you that I've been a corporate lawyer, I've been a biotech lawyer, I've been a online dating lawyer. I'm now a cash for gold buyer. Cannabis may be one of the most legitimate, cleanest things I ever do in my life. So I'm okay with it. If you guys aren't okay with it, I'll do it, and thank you very much. And after cajoling them for a while, they finally wrapped their heads around the opportunity. We all joined forces. Out of that, Canadian Cannabis Clinics, which became the largest network of cannabis specialized medical clinics, was born. None of us were by any means advocates for cannabis. None of us were very experienced with cannabis. We just saw a great opportunity to do something very interesting. It turns out that cannabis is actually an incredibly potent therapeutic, and it's certainly a much better recreational drug than alcohol, and at least in terms of its effects on the body. And so we had an incredible success with that. We sold that company to Aurora Cannabis. We joined Aurora. We helped Aurora grow from being a very small cannabis producer to being one of the largest global producers of cannabis. As mentioned, or as alluded to, it opened our eyes to the potential of once stigmatized medicine, that cannabis, which I, truthfully thought of was not really medicine, I realized was very potent medicine. And so after we left Aurora and we started learning about what was happening in the psychedelics industry, or what was happening with psychedelics, which at that time, this is the middle of 2018, Michael Pollan had just published How to Change Your Mind. MAPS had just been granted breakthrough therapy designation. And a number of online stores were popping up in Canada openly selling psilocybin mushrooms. I realized that we had the opportunity to take that experience in the cannabis industry of bringing legitimacy and transparency and scientific and medical rigor to something that was once stigmatized, and replicate that, but into something that is going to have way greater impact, on the future of humanity, way greater impact on the future of our society, way greater impact on the future of healthcare. And so that's how our interest in psychedelics was born. And truthfully, to that point, I think I had tried mushrooms once while very, very drunk. And so I had no idea what the experience of being on mushrooms was like, but I had almost no experience with psychedelics whatsoever. I did, however, have a lot of experience with meditation and coaching and therapy, because it's something that I've done for my own reasons over the last 15 years. So I had a sense of what the impact psychedelics could have on the world, just based on my experience with meditation and deep meditation and all that kind of stuff. And so I knew that this was going to be an industry that the impact, I truly believe it's going to be one of the most significant cultural and medical and scientific industries of the next 20 years, to be quite honest, in its potential impact. And so that's that inflection point of meeting Joseph and Hanan and Leo and starting in the cannabis industry was the third inflection point to where I am today.
Wow. Okay. So, you guys get started with Field Trip. You decide to go into the ketamine side because that's still legal in the United States. I think it's psilocybin and MDMA is another few years. It's looking like, I think, 2023.
Yep.
How do you land on ketamine? And then maybe the higher level question of how's it going? You guys have opened these clinics. What's the process like to educate the public and get people coming in? And what kind of results are you seeing?
Sure. So how do we land on ketamine? Well, we learn about what's happening in the psychedelics industry, and I have that same kind of electric feeling I had in that first conversation about cannabis, about we got to do this, we got to do something here, this is going to be huge. And then unlike cannabis, where legalization was happening, there was no legalization immediately on the horizon for psychedelics. So the next question was what the F do we do? How do we start a business in psychedelics when literally we can't do anything legally? And so we spent a lot of time thinking about how do we do something. And that's when we started learning about how ketamine was starting to be used as a psychedelic in some circles. And oh, okay, well, there's an option. And we spoke to Rick Doblin, and we spoke to the folks at Beckley, and we spoke to the folks at Compass Pathways, and all of them said, there's going to be no money in drug development. Psychedelics are known. That's not where the money is. The money is going to be in delivering psychedelic therapies. And because you can't do this in conventional clinics, we need to build new clinical infrastructure to deliver psychedelic therapies. And that was just coincidental that we had just started and sold a business building clinics in a once stigmatized medical area. So we had a natural aptitude towards building out clinical infrastructure and a good knowledge base to start from. And because ketamine was legal and being used, like, okay, we can start with ketamine, start building the clinical infrastructure, build a business, build a brand, build patient relationships, build the referral network using ketamine assisted therapy. And then when MDMA and psilocybin become legalized or approved, then we'll just be there. We'll just be able to turn on that switch and start delivering these other forms of therapies as well. And so that's how we started down that path. But we realized quite early on that psychedelics are not like conventional pharma. They're not like conventional biotech, because it's experiential medicine, because the set and setting of the psychedelic experience has an impact on the therapeutic outcomes. We realized that anyone doing drug development with psychedelic molecules, without also focusing on the experience and the location and the therapy and all the other aspects of a psychedelic experience that seem to have an impact on the therapeutic outcome, that in order to build the future of this industry, you had to be working on both, and you have to be working on them in tandem and together, because to focus on one without the other is really leaving half of the equation out of your control. And so with Field Trip, what we're doing is doing both. We're building the clinical infrastructure. We're delivering ketamine-assisted therapy, but we're also using all of the data that we're collecting there to help develop the next generation of psychedelic molecules. And to answer your question, how's it going? Fantastic. The results we're seeing from the patients who come through are, just as even more life-changing than we saw in cannabis. In the cannabis industry, we got all sorts of letters and emails from people who'd be like, I literally tried everything to help deal with my back pain and nothing worked. And I tried cannabis for the first time, thanks to your clinics, yesterday. And truthfully, it did nothing for my back pain, but I slept through the night for the first time in 7 years. And that alone has made enough difference in my life. And got all sorts of messages like that. With our work with ketamine, it's even more powerful. We're seeing objectively people go from severe to moderately severe depression to minimal to non-existent depression, over the course of treatment. And that benefit's sustained for a month or more. Same with anxiety. We're just like, the objective metrics are fantastic relative to current treatment options. And then there's the subjective stories. We've got the story of the military veteran who, after being in theater in Afghanistan, lost all empathy for people and started to develop a sense of empathy after going through our treatment. We have the stories of survivors of sexual trauma who now see themselves as beautiful again, even though they couldn't see themselves as beautiful for so much of their lives because of their experiences. And so it's really amazing to see the outcomes of how it's transforming people's lives literally every day. These are truly life-changing experiences.
And what does the process look like? So I guess you come in to Field Trip as a new patient. Do you need a doctor's prescription from somewhere else, or can I just come in and get started? And then what does the treatment look like in terms of seeing a therapist, being on ketamine, et cetera? Very curious to dive in a little there.
Yeah, so you can't just walk in off the street. We do screening. One of the things we did successfully in the cannabis industry, which I think helped this cannabis industry grow, was that we focused on doing good medicine, which meant we screened patients. We made sure cannabis medicine was appropriate. We brought that lens to the psychedelics industry. So we screen our patients. We make sure that ketamine-assisted therapy is both appropriate from a mental health perspective as well as a physical health perspective. By and large, ketamine is an extremely safe drug, but it's not appropriate in all circumstances for all people. So we screen people and make sure it's appropriate. Assuming everything looks good, then we'll set up an initial meeting with your therapeutic team.
Quick pause. Sorry, Ronan, there. Some of the listeners might not be familiar, but something that Michael Pollan, for example, talks about is like the betterment of well people, of like folks that maybe aren't, everyone has a certain amount of neuroses and anxiety. Are you guys focused on people that just have like very acute conditions of depression, anxiety, or can someone come in who just wants to become more loving or compassionate or work a little bit on reducing their anxiety?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, that determination is made by the psychiatrist,
Okay.
the overseeing psychiatrist. To start, we were focused only on people with more acute conditions, simply because, in addition to delivering good care, we need to be seen as being prudent, thoughtful operators. So focusing on the people most in need and showing incredible results is a good way to just engender trust with the broader medical community, so they can see that you're doing good medicine and they're not just a cowboy or a cowgirl, so to speak, in terms of approach to something that's got a lot of stigma and a lot of misinformation to overcome. Now that we've been operating for a while, established ourselves within the medical communities in which we're operating, we are now feeling more comfortable, or at least our medical teams are feeling more comfortable expanding the scope. We can't go to the point of a person who just wants to feel more loving. We still need to establish some form of medical need, but it doesn't have to be severe or acute mental health conditions. If it's someone who's just going through adjustment disorder because they're going through a breakup, or someone who's just feeling stuck in life, if our medical team feels that's appropriate and that ketamine assisted therapy can help, that's within the scope of the conditions that we'll treat right now. So not quite the betterment of the well, but the betterment of the nearly well, maybe is a better way to think of it.
Got it. And then I know we're coming up on time, so I totally want to be mindful of that. In terms of like marketing Field Trip Health, how does that work? Is this in the ketamine market because it's semi-legal, or there's some approval for it? It's not like an over-the-counter medication. Are you still like marketing online, doing any like performance marketing, paid marketing? How do you get people to come in and find you guys?
Yeah, we're doing all sorts of marketing. I mean, it's important to keep in mind that what we're offering is not access to ketamine. It's access to ketamine-assisted therapy, which means people have to come to our clinics, and the ketamine is administered here, and we oversee them here, and they don't go home until the effects of the ketamine have been worn off. So this is not, like a dispensary where people just come and buy and we prescribe. It's much more controlled. It's much more thoughtful. But yeah, we're doing all sorts of marketing, which means we're marketing to patients, trying to reach out to the communities of people who are experiencing mental health challenges. We're reaching out to the medical communities because, truthfully, on a number of levels, people who experience refractory depression and anxiety are really challenging patients, both from a medical perspective, because current treatment options don't work. So the family doctors who are the front line, or the psychiatrists who are the front line, who just tried different iterations of different antidepressants with little success, those patients are not being served adequately despite the doctor's best efforts. And so giving them a new treatment option to refer their patients to is actually a wonderful benefit for, the front line of medical care. In the same token, the statistics around depression and mental health and employment and productivity are remarkable. For every 1 point improvement in a person's PHQ-9 score, which is one of the primary measures of depression, there's a corresponding 1.6% increase in productivity from that employee, right? So think about that. The better mood your employees are in, the more productive they are. Similarly, at least based on statistics out of Canada, I haven't found the equivalent ones out of the US yet, people who experience depression or anxiety consume about 50% more medical resources than people who do not have depression or anxiety. And so from an employer perspective, it's not only good business to ensure your employees are getting access to high quality mental health care, it's also good business because you spend less on all the other kind of care that needs to be provided to them as well. And so doing that active outreach both to the medical community as well as the payers is part of our marketing plan as well.
Amazing. This has been great, Ronan. A lot of info in there. I'm glad we got to get into your bio and story and sort of like what led you to creating this innovative, forward-thinking, high growth company. Lots more to unpack in terms of this space. So hopefully we could do a round 2 and have Michael, your medical director, or anyone else on the clinical team to dive a little bit deeper, because I think there's a lot of ground to cover, and it's really exciting to see not only, in the last few years, mental health has become more destigmatized, or care for mental health has become more destigmatized, but now that there's access and this renaissance to these different types of therapy that can help a lot of people and reduce a lot of the suffering that is very prevalent right now in and around the world. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for coming on and sharing, and excited to do this again soon.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I feel like I talk too much and listen too little, but next time, if you have Mike on, I think certainly having Dr. Michael Verbora, our Canadian medical director, on would be a great idea. We didn't dive into the science of psychedelics. We mentioned that there's a renaissance happening, but we really didn't talk about why that renaissance is happening. And I think that's an important part of the conversation, because I think as people start to understand the safety and the efficacy of what we're talking about, it really changes minds quite quickly.
Yeah, I think you did an effective job and a great job setting the stage, and it would be awesome to dive a little deeper into the science for sure.
Let's make that happen.
Yeah. Thank you, awesome. Ronan. Have a great day and rest of your week, and we'll chat again soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, John. Have a great day.
Thanks, man. Bye.